Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Still as Bright, presented by the Cultural Considerations Working Group of the Moon Village Association. I am Remo Rapetti, co-chair of the working group. Still as Bright is a book, a beautiful book, written by the well-known writer and author Christopher Cokinos. It deals with an illuminating history of the moon from antiquity to tomorrow, as the subtitle of the book says. I would say that it is about humanity's long, varied, contradictory relationship with the moon in different eras, in different places, and even in a possible future. All intertwined with the author's special personal relationship with our satellite ever since he, as a boy, was given a telescope by his father and became a passionate moon watcher. Christopher is here tonight and will tell us why he wrote this book, what he expected to achieve, and which future is ahead of us. To support his narration, we have invited another well-known writer and public speaker, and many other things, in fact, Francis French, an appreciated historian of the Apollo missions, who will tell us about the little-known episodes connected with Al Warden and other astronauts. After the presentations, Lisa Pettibone, visual artist and the new co-chair of this working group, and Giulio Prisco, futurist, cosmist, and author, will add comments and questions. Questions can be asked also by the registered attendees via the chat button on your screen. And now, Christopher, please start your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Nodding. I see nodding. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Remo, for that introduction. Lisa as well. Thank you for being here. I want to thank Giulio and Glafki as well for their help and support. I am trying to remember how long I've been involved now in different ways with the Cultural Considerations Working Group. It's been at least, I think, 3 years. And very delighted to be a part of this. And I want to thank Francis as well for joining us. I've admired his work from afar for quite a while. I think that the first real substantial introduction to Francis's work was reading Al Warden's beautiful memoir, Falling to Earth, which he helped Al with. And I had the pleasure of meeting Al Warden and Dave Scott, both in Tucson at Space Fest, which was, and I don't know that it will return, but was a lovely summer gathering of space enthusiasts and astronauts. And I had the pleasure, excuse me, of publishing or republishing, I should say, one of Al's poems in Beyond Earth's Edge, which some of you may know, Poetry of Spaceflight. So thank you all for being here, whether it's morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, for your time and kindness. And what I want to do is I like to kind of give people a little overview of what I'm planning on doing, so you sort of know where I am at any given point, and be respectful of your time, of course. So I'm going to read, I'll start with a reading from the prologue. And actually, I know that I tried this once before to stream this as well. Let's see, I don't know if I can get this to everybody or not. But Lafki, I'll put this in the chat. This is a YouTube video. If you want to do this, normally what I do when I give the first section of the book that I read from, I play a lunar reconnaissance orbiter video that you can find on YouTube that has this beautiful sort of whole sequence of the lunar day and night. It's a moon high definition 4K Claire de Lune. I just turned the beautiful music off, and there you go. Thank you for sharing that. So if you want to play that I prefer playing it at 0.75 speed because it times out perfectly, but I think it's too much bandwidth to do. So I'm just going to read here for a few minutes at the beginning, and then I'm going to share some slides and just sort of talk through some of the stories and themes and aspects of this book. As Remus was saying, it's a comprehensive kind of look at the moon, but also with a personal take. There's memoir. I like to joke now that it's the story of a boy and his telescope. So you'll get a little bit of that as well. After I give you a little bit of a sense through sharing some slides and just talking through some of the stories and themes of the book, aspects of the book, I'm going to read to you actually a little bit from my sort of first childhood encounter with the moon, which is perhaps ironic because I was a child of Apollo. I grew up and watching the Apollo landings. I vividly remember the Apollo 11 landing, but it was actually the moon of science fiction films, not unlike the poster behind me. I wish I had a Chesley Bonestell poster behind me, but so I'm going to read a little bit about that fictional moon of my childhood and Chesley Bonestell, who's a space artist from the 40s and 50s who influenced various views of space exploration. And despite his well-known sense of accuracy, he actually created a pretty fictionalized landscape of the moon. So it's one of the themes of the book. So what we want a place to be, like the moon, or in my case, that one of the personal strands in the book is my tussling between Arizona and Utah, and which place feels most at home to me. So the sense of real places being taken on their own terms as much as possible and how we relate to them is very much a theme of the book. So I'll read a little bit from that, and then I'll transition into reading a little bit about Apollo 15 and a little bit about Al Worden in particular, because he and his fellow Apollo 15 astronauts, first heavily scientifically trained mission to the moon, a J mission as it was called in NASA parlance, that scientific grounding gave them a sense of the moon more on its own terms than we had approached it before. So that's a kind of a sweep of my talk here. And let me go ahead and get started. After a sip of coffee, hold on. Okay, so is the sound still okay? I've got my paperwork sort of covered. Okay, awesome, excellent, thank you. So I'm going to read actually the first two sections from the prologue. Typically, I only read the first section, but I thought I'd share the second one as well because it has, again, a little bit of that blending of memoir and the space age. So this is the opening to Still as Bright. And again, thank you for being here. Each month, when the moon returns at dusk, lit and waxing, the first sea I routinely observe is Mare Crisium, the Sea of Crises, and the first lake I look for is the foreshortened Lacus Temporis, the Lake of Time. That seems just so. Mare Crisium is a huge plain of solid lava close to the nearside's eastern limb that looks elliptical. You can see it with your own eyes. And in the telescope, Crisium is ringed by headlands, dotted with craters and rippled with low ridges like cast-aside thoughts. Lacus Temporis, despite its weighty name, is a banal patch of gray rock, though shaped appropriately, a bit like an hourglass. The moon is always there, at least in our lives, lit or dark, seen or not, a frigid or scalding globe of pits and rubble, of peaks and scars, our helpful companion in gravity and evolution, a symbol, a surface, a nightlight during its days-long lunar morning, and a silent siren for nocturnal predators, for mythic werewolves, lovers, geologists, and soon again, the astronauts. For me, until recently, as for other stargazers, the moon was a bane that bleached out fainter gray-green galaxies and nebula that one might otherwise see in the eyepieces of backyard telescopes or on the computer screens of professional observatories. Not long ago, I found myself questioning, if not everything, then quite a bit. Mortality, happiness, profession. I'd run my hand along the spines of philosophy titles in a used bookstore in Tucson, Arizona, tip one out and purchase it to read at home in a certain silence. I'd lie down to meditate, trying to focus on breath instead of mistakes. I'd talk with my wife, Kathy, in a wide, gravelly yard behind our old adobe house beneath mesquites or the giant tamarisk. I'd fallen for that tree the first time we saw this place, a 19th century ruin that Kathy would go on to restore, and that would be our home for just 2 short years of our longer Tucson sojourn. Too tired, too low, I couldn't bring myself to haul the telescope south of the city, where skies darken, in the Andromeda galaxy, blossoms enough to be seen with the naked eye. Ever since moving to the desert from 4 riverside acres in semi-rural northern Utah, I spent far less time under night skies than I used to. One of several touchstones I'd slowly lost in those clotted, frantic city years. I'd forgotten what mattered most, what Byron called the heart, still as loving. One night, as Kathy and I sat beside a fire stoked in a battered wood stove, which was once the house's only source of heat and which we had since moved outside, there it was. Bright, unhurried, sliced by light and shadow, the moon. I had never paid it much attention, despite a childhood smitten with Apollo flights, years when I would tape record television reports of the last missions and those of Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz rendezvous. I replayed the news anchors' voices, Walter Cronkite, Jules Bergman, on a cassette player at night in a dark bedroom in our trailer outside of Indianapolis. I was dreamy with imagined escape. Before then, I had sometimes used a 3-inch Edmund scientific reflector my father had given me, and with it, I would dash across the lunar landscape, and dash was right because the telescope was rickety and hard to use. I caught the moon in snatches. Too embarrassed to ask for help, I didn't say a word to my father, especially after he left my mother, sister, and me. Somewhere and sometime, the telescope also disappeared. That night in our Tucson backyard, I looked at the moon with my own eyes, and touched by the shadows of delicate mesquite leaves that it cast, I felt something clear, something inevitable, something sweet without striving. Not a child's silver spacesuit fantasy, not an adult's grasping for achievement and flattery, but a sober calm and a grounded curiosity. I could go there, I thought. I could watch and learn. It felt like an epiphany, seeing that moon waxing past its half-moon phase, brimming with potential and shining peacefully above ordinary darkness. By then, I had learned that in a few weeks, it would be the 50th anniversary of a forgotten, once heralded photograph of the lunar crater named for Copernicus. The photo had been snapped by an orbiting probe sent to map the dangerous surface for safe landing sites before the astronauts descended. I was intrigued. I've always been interested in forgotten anniversaries. They tie me to history's chancy sweep, and they're a form of memento mori. They humble me and somehow make me feel loved. I decided to find that photograph, to learn why it had garnered so much attention. This small adventure in discovering something lost would be, like the moonlit night with Kathy, the beginning of my backyard journey to the moon and its many histories. It would make my skin tingle. For the first time in a very long time, I would be part of something bigger than myself, and every month it would light my way. So here's the next section, and you're going to see that photograph in just a couple minutes. On November 24th, 1966, Lunar Orbiter 2 took the photograph with a dual camera system using a velocity height sensor to adjust the film for orbital motion. Some sources say the photograph was taken on November 23rd, another on November 28th. The craft, regardless, then developed the image in its own darkroom bay, scanned the negative, and transmitted the data 5 days later to a world that would be so stunned by this first ever otherworldly close-up. The image would be called the picture of the century. Despite this, as the years passed, almost no one would remember the photo. This was the decade of NASA's quest for the moon, and when, as a substitute for other competitions with the communist world, including war itself, President John F. Kennedy declared in 1961 that we would, by the end of the decade, send Americans to the moon and return them safely home. At the time of this challenge, America had all of 15 minutes of suborbital space experience. And it's not that Kennedy particularly cared about space or for going to the moon or for what the moon could tell us about ourselves and the cosmos, which it turns out is still quite a lot. It's rather that he, like most Americans, had been stung by a string of Soviet space firsts, including the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and the first ever human flight by Yuri Gagarin 4 years later. Crucial to the planned moon landings were such automated efforts as Lunar Orbiter 2 and others in that series, along with Ranger's designed crash landings, photo after photo, in dizzying closer than bam sequences, as well as the more sophisticated Surveyor missions, which soft landed in trenched lunar soil. These were, as a 1960s NASA publication put it, and you'll note the gendered language, blazing a trail for man to follow. Humanity aimed for the moon and surely next for Mars, or at least select parts of humanity were so aimed, namely Soviets and Americans, and perhaps even just some Americans, for, as Gil Scott-Heron would later sing or rap, Whitey on the moon. To a child, as to the engineer, all seemed possible. Amid nuclear brinkmanship, assassinations, and riots, space was aspiration, and as a child, I sensed that too. I was only 6 when Apollo 11 landed on the tail end of duck-and-cover drills and wondering about flashes of light. Lightning or an atomic blast targeting Eli Lilly and Company, where my father worked. I sensed the troubles of a wider world. There were troubles in the living room, too. Space was the inchoate hope of something better than an angry, broken family living in a post-divorce trailer with my shell-shocked mom and bratty sister, the cupboards nearly bare at the end of each month. When we moved into a decent apartment close enough to the junior high and high school that I could walk to them, I nurtured dreams of flight. I joined the Civil Air Patrol, which is the civilian reserve of the Air Force, which on one memorable weekend meant riding in a KC-135 Stratotanker with fellow cadets as we nestled next to the boom operator, watching a B-52 bomber refuel just yards away from the tanker, 2 mated metal insects thousands of feet above the fields and forests of the otherwise stupefying American Midwest. Though we weren't well off, the school district was, and the high school had a flight simulator that allowed me to pass ground school, my first step to the sky. Model airplanes hung from my bedroom ceiling, and along with the requisite Farrah Fawcett poster, I tacked up photos of astronauts and their needle-like T-38 Talons, still my favorite plane. After joining the Air Force, I would, of course, become an astronaut. And I looked at my Viewmaster frames of real and fictional spacecraft, those bright, backlit dioramas that tricked the eye into seeing 3 worldly, colorful dimensions contained within a light box. This would be my future. I held it in my hands. To this day, I remember Miss Hawk literally pulling me out of advanced algebra, though I don't know why, failure at a problem or screwing around or both. And by the next class, I was in remedial math, resigned overnight to never having wings pinned on a uniform. Back then, I gave up easily. I gave up not only my ambition to fly, but also the sky itself, not returning to it till late in my 20s when I sought starry vistas on my own, away from a fading first marriage. With a small spotting scope, I concentrated on birds, Jupiter, Saturn, and tiny spindly galaxies, everything but the moon, which was both too easy, it's not hard to find, and too confusing. There are, after all, a lot of holes in it. Even as I graduated to a much larger telescope, this neglect continued. Now I know what I was missing, an entire world and its epic story, and how some of us can travel there without ever leaving the Earth. So that is the opening here of the book, and I'm going to, let's see here, share my screen. and walk you through. There we go. Is the slide showing for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent, excellent. Um, that's the photograph. That's the photograph of Copernicus crater. And the rest of the prologue is a kind of previewing of the book, as well as a little bit of a detective story. The photograph was on the front pages of the New York Times and other newspapers around the world. It really garnered a lot of attention. And one of my confusions was the way the photograph was cropped in different publications. It really wasn't clear what I was looking at. And so I tell the story in the prologue of meeting Bill Hartman, whose name I knew, but whose legacy I really began to sort of understand as I worked on this book. So Bill, also in Tucson, had been a graduate student with Gerard Kuiper, the famous planetary scientist who really sort of, with Harold Urey in the 1950s and 60s, got us to pay attention to the solar system when no one was really paying attention to it. So Bill Hartman, who also figures large in the current formation theory of the moon, which we can talk about I will talk about in just a second. I go to his house in Tucson and we take a look at all these sort of crops of this photograph. And so what you're looking at in the near ground, what look like small hills, those are about a mile high, and those are the central peaks of the crater Copernicus. And all that rough stuff in the background, those are the terraces that rise up to get to the sort of plain, the quote unquote sea behind the crater Copernicus. And this picture was so important because it was the first time we saw the moon in this oblique angle, like, looking out of a window of an airplane and seeing it as a world, right? As a place. And the descriptions from people like Walter Sullivan and other science writers were just so lovely. And many of them compared it to the American West, the Badlands of South Dakota, the Grand Canyon, the western face of the Wasatch here in Utah, where I live. And so I found this story inspiring. And I also found one of the photo technicians, Arthur Cosgrove, who remembered very vividly being in Australia as the picture was scanned, like slowly line by line by line, and being one of the first people to see this vista unfold before his eyes. I think it's still just a magnificent photograph. So one of the things this book took me to was not just the moon, but our prehistory and our very long relationship with this light in the sky that for a long time it was unclear what this was, right? And we can't really enter the prehistoric mind, but we can look at these artifacts that help us at least begin to access how they were understanding the moon. So this is an artifact from Aubry Blanchard in France. It was a grotto, a prehistoric cave in southern France. This is about, say, 45,000 years old. And those little incisions, those dots that you can see, especially on the top image, a scholar named Alexander Marshak interpreted those as the phases of the moon in a whole lunation. A lunation is the lunar cycle in a month moon, right? We see that. And so whether you accept this interpretation of this particular artifact, I begin the book in sort of the bigger sort of external story with this human relationship to the moon as a timekeeping device, something between the days and nights of the sun, right? And seasons, at least seasons in places a little, farther from the equator. And Marshak and others really pay attention not only to these artifacts as ways of keeping time, but Marshak makes this assertion again. It's a great story. I don't know if it's at all ever provable, but he makes a compelling argument that this kind of sophisticated timekeeping, I mean, this is science, this is empirical. This is prehistoric, natural observation to try to understand something, not understand what the moon was or made of, but to understand, how it's moving across the sky. And those motions are really complicated, actually. But in his story of this kind of prehistoric timekeeping was a way that human self-awareness and self-consciousness came to be. Okay, so the moon might have been not just sort of at the beginning of the planet's origins, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but perhaps also have played this significant role in sort of human self-awareness. Certainly it played a role in time. These are the 3 moons of winter. You can see those figures with the sort of circular heads, sort of stylized. This is in Parowan Gap in southern Utah. According to the indigenous people of that area today, it's a story of famine. And according to some archaeoastronomers, it's, you know, a story of keeping time, the 3 moons of winter. And it's always struck me that those stories are not mutually exclusive, right? So one of many, many artifacts of prehistoric and pre-Western science approaches to understanding the moon. This is the rabbit on the face of the moon from the Aztec Codex. And I, you know, spent as much time as I could, you know, putting my arms around these stories of the moon and its place in human culture. Really, that's plural, human cultures. That was a bit of a daunting task because, you know, writing from my standpoint and then trying to sort of gather all this information, you know, many books could be written about the folklore and mythology of the moon. But I thought, you know, it's enough to sort of point to these cross-cultural themes, seeing shapes on the face of the moon, rabbits in many cultures, frogs, other, you know, sort of human faces and human stories. And so in telling the sort of folklore and mythology of the moon, I tried to sort of bear witness to that, to do honor to those stories. I think it's interesting, and this might be an, I don't know if this is an offensive juxtaposition of images or not. We've got the first realistic depiction of the moon behind the thief Gestus. You can see his face is in pain. This is Jean van Eyck. This is in the 1400s. I'm going to say 1452, late 15th century, of the first realistic representation of the moon in Western art, which is its own story that it took so long to have this. But even then, it's kind of stylized. I don't know if you can see the dark blue spots on the moon. Galileo called those the ancient dark spots. That's the lava plains that some people thought were seas because of that bluish cast. But it's almost a little bit of a stylized skull in that painting. So the visual representations of the moon and our stories about them, of course, continue. The photograph on the other side there, on the right side, is from the Fritz Lang movie Frau im Mond, sort of a journey to the moon. And of course, Georges Méliès's From the Earth to the Moon was one of the sort of first depictions of that. So we get to Galileo, and he looms large in this book. So from prehistory and folklore and mythology, and also some philosophical attempts in the Middle East, in the Near East, and in Greece, to understand, you know, well, is this a perfect sphere? Is this just a light? Is it an object? You know, what exactly is the nature of the moon? Galileo reveals it to us, and he does it with a telescope. So I like to say, anytime you're looking at the moon through a telescope, you are in the lineage of Galileo, and you can experience the same kind of, you know, wonder and surprise that he experienced when he looks at the moon. The telescope in that image is actually a replica from the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. I was writing this book during COVID, so a trip to Italy was out of the question. So Remo, others there in Italy someday, I hope to get there to see the real Galileo telescope, and as well as meet some people in the flesh. But Galileo's story is, you know, one often told, right? So I won't spend too much time going over it, but he sees telescopes coming into the marketplace, you know, in the early 1600s, and he's you know, in his 40s. I think he's 45 when he makes his own telescope. A brilliant guy, extremely busy, a scholar. He's on the make, basically, like he's building his career And he sees these little spy glasses and recognizes their potential. So he teaches himself how to grind and polish lenses. He makes a better telescope, better than anyone else at that time. And you can see the result on the left side of the screen. He draws these pictures. They're also a little stylized. Galileo was trained as an artist. And Lisa may know that as well. And so there's a little bit of, suggestion that he conveyed the moon in maybe slightly exaggerated fashion in order to convey that there's landscape here. This is topography. So he's seeing light and shadow. He doesn't directly observe craters or mountains in that telescope, but he sees the shadows. He sees this inference of landscape. And the point is that the moon is not this smooth object put in a perfect cosmos, right? It is a world. It's an actual place. And Galileo's changing of our perception in that way and using a technology for the first time to extend human senses. This is really the beginning of modern science. And so if the moon is a place, the next natural question is, what might be there? Because God would not waste a world. And there's a theme running through this book about places and what we imagine them to be and what they actually turn out to be and how that rubs up against our prior worldviews. And so the accommodation here of, okay, so the moon is actually, it's a place, it's a world. It's not something that God placed as a smooth, perfect sphere, as a perfect circle. Which also has a resonance with Plato. But God would not waste a world. So obviously there has to be life there. And so here's some depictions of that. The lower right screen with the Batman, the lunar Batman. This is from 1835. This is actually from the Great Moon Hoax, which you may know about, where an enterprising journalist describes a massive telescope that Sir John Herschel has built in South Africa. And, it's actually a beautiful series of articles. He's completely made up stories about, what he sees on the moon. But also you have on the large image on the left, that's from Franz von Paula Gruithuisen, 1835, I believe. And this is a natural formation on the moon. You can see it, but he interpreted this series of sort of bisecting ridges as an artificial structure, as an actual village or moon or a city on the moon. And then much later into the 20th century, and this is well after the moon has been established as, it's very hot, it's very cold, there's no running water, there's no liquid water, there's very little atmosphere. I tell the story of W.H. Pickering, who almost literally exiles himself to Jamaica, builds his own observatory, observes the moon, and believes that he is seeing insects or vegetation moving across the moon. It's very much like an echo of Percival Lowell's visions of life on Mars. And Pickering believes to the end of his days, and this is into the 1930s when he was a lone voice and much ridiculed, dies sort of in this sad state, believing that the moon actually still had life on it. Oh, and if you're interested, H.G. Wells, the great science fiction writer, his book First Men in the Moon from 1901 was influenced by W.H. Pickering, and there's a beautiful description of sunrise and the plants coming to life in that novel. But this is more like what we think the moon looks like. Excuse me. This is a photograph of a plaster of Paris model made from drawings done by James Naismith, a Scottish engineer and obsessed selenographer, a lunar astronomer. This is from the 19th century. I believe there's only one of these plaster of Paris models left in London at the Science Museum. Again, something I hope to see someday. And this is actually a very realistic depiction of what the lunar surface looks like. So you have this battle, in a sense. There are two battles that go on. One is there life on the moon, and or is it this dead body? And the overwhelming evidence becomes it's a dead body. And you have this argument over what causes these features. So you see the crater, and that's a term used until recently, really, in reference to volcanoes. And so what's causing this landscape? Is it volcanism, or these, eruptions on the surface of the moon causing these, giant mountains to form and so forth? Or are meteorites, giant rocks, right, hitting the moon over and over again? Now, this may sound kind of arcane, maybe less sort of philosophically significant than, is there life on the moon? Are we alone? And, there's a whole sort of story here. Of course, it is ongoing about our projecting these questions, are we alone in the universe? But this debate between volcanism and impacts plays out against a worldview of order or disorder. There's the move against sort of catastrophic ways of thinking and explaining landforms as geology takes hold as a science in the 19th century, wanting to distance itself from a kind of biblical view of, catastrophes wrought in very quick fashion. As it turns out, it was impacts, it was rocks. So as we look at the moon as a place, we also have to figure out what it is we're looking at precisely. And this is one of the early moon maps. So I get to tell the story of the first space race, which is the race to name the features of the moon, which is also bound up in trying to figure out where ships are navigating at sea. That's another story that you can read about in the book. But ego, politics, right? Fame and fortune. Who gets to put the names on the moon? Who gets to decide what these features are called? So that's another, sort of wonderful story of some really colorful personalities and egos involved in doing this. And so we map the moon, it becomes a real world. And for many people, it looks like this. It looks like this. It looks pointed. It's like a kind of lunar version of the Alps or the Himalayas. And we'll come to see that that was really incorrect, even as 19th century selenographers knew as they were drawing these pictures, that round objects can cast sharp shadows. And so one of the stories of the book is the story of the sublime, the way we react to overwhelming landscapes and sort of our cliched expectations of what the lunar sublime might look like. This was one of the formation theories of the moon, that it was spun out from the early Earth and came out of the Pacific Ocean. This is beautiful, romantic, and completely wrong. But well, Francis is there on the San Diego coast. He's there. So I don't know about you, but every time I look at the Pacific when I'm there, I think of this vision of the moon being birthed out of the Pacific Ocean. I know it's wrong, but I think it's beautiful. But the formation of the moon becomes another one of those really sort of epic scientific stories. And as we understand this coming closer into time, I'm kind of following the history of our relationship with the moon chronologically. We begin to see, well, is this moon as static as it was established? That there's no air, there's no water. But Winifred Cameron and Barbara Middlehurst, who was at the University of Arizona, these are two pioneering women astronomers. I tell their stories really for the first time, and it's the story of seeing lights on the moon, gases, little clouds. It's kind of controversial field, still controversial, called transient lunar phenomenon. And so this is a story of, I don't want to say fringe, but, a little bit to the left of mainstream lunar science, although it's, become clear that, yeah, gases seep out of the moon. And it's possible through a variety of physical processes that those could cause lights. But there's some amazing stories about especially in the 60s, when we're mapping the moon, not only from the probes that I was talking about, but from telescopes here on Earth, trying to understand, what it is the astronauts are going to encounter when they get there. So I have a great affection and admiration for Winifred Cameron, who's one of the first female scientists at NASA, actually. And then maybe less admiration and affection for this gentleman in the suit, surrounded by his Nazi Party supporters. As a child of Apollo, I did not know the story of Wernher von Braun, and I have come sort of a reckoning with that in sort of out-of-the-way museum in Kansas called the Cosmosphere, which I would recommend you actually visit. It's a wonderful facility. They were the ones who refurbished the Liberty Bell capsule. And it was there that I learned the story of Wernher von Braun, who I previously thought of, as simply as a brilliant rocket engineer. Well, he initiates the space age, as you may know, with the V2 missile, and by tying his wagon to the stars to the Nazi regime in the 30s. There's, of course, a story of moral complicity. It seems clear from biography of Michael Neufeld's that von Braun himself, in fact, was guilty of war crimes. The Germans using slave labor to build the V2 missile. So it's a story that I tell in the book to sort of ground myself in a way with, again, this theme of what one wants the story to be versus what it actually is. But it does lead us, of course, to the achievements of the Apollo missions. So much discussed still. We're heading back to the moon. Remo was, foreshadowing a bit my own interest in what we do next with the Artemis program. This is a view of Apollo 15 at Hadley Rill, which is a feature you can see through the telescope. As I write this book, I'm looking through the telescope. I'm learning my own sort of ways around the moon, knowing, getting to know those features that have been named in, various ways over the years. And, the thrill of seeing Hadley Rill through the telescope and knowing the history of that never gets old. So we are going back. We're going back because there's water ice, as I'm sure you all know, that's been discovered at the lunar South Pole. And the Orion capsule here will be taking, we hope, right at the end of next year, no earlier than September of 2025, the Artemis 2 crew to go around the moon. It won't orbit. It'll be a flyby using the Space Launch System. And the last chapter of the book is my sort of reckoning with that future, and also then looking at the moon through a much larger telescope than I have at home. This is the 60-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, once the largest telescope in the world. And I had an amazing night looking at the moon through that telescope and seeing, and I'll show you some pictures of that here in just a few minutes. But the book culminates in that sort of personal pilgrimage to, I'm a secular person, but observatory is a sacred space in my world, and then thinking about what encountering the moon through the telescope and through this history, all these years I spent writing this book, what that might tell us about the future of the moon. Well, to write about the future of the moon, I also wrote about the past, and this is a photograph of a depiction of the moon by the space artist Chesley Bonestell. So I think I'm just going to be mindful of time here. I might just read just this last section. So I learned the moon through watching science fiction movies on late night television in Indianapolis, Indiana, where there wasn't much to watch on television. I guess in that era, that was just always the case everywhere. So these were reruns. I'm not contemporaneous with Chesley Bonestell in that sense, but I started watching these science fiction movies. So let me just read a little bit from this is my first encounter with the moon as a child. Okay. For the first 6 years or so, my family lived in the bland white split level on Suburban Drive in Indianapolis, where, past bedtime, my sister Vicky and I watched the historic first moon landing, the ghostly video snowstorm and white plane and black sky of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, who somehow moved both in front of the lunar module and behind it at the same time, as though they were able to pass through solid objects at will, an enviable superpower. The evening of July 20th, 1969, I flew a cardboard lunar lander purchased by my parents at a gas station around the dark kitchen where my mother would make spindly casseroles, for which she stopped caring, beside windows to some other impossible life in green mammotus skies. Baron the Dachshund circled his bed like a Sputnik, and my misplaced metal planes sliced my sister's foot on the stairs. That night, however, all was forgotten as Walter Cronkite shed a tear and the astronauts slow jumped on Motorola's moon. I flew some more, my mouth a radio by the stove, by cupboards that rose like crater walls of a greater durance. I controlled tiny scouts, brave and afraid, soaring over Formica and the cavernous sink whose dishes bore fork scrape and the surface tension of soapy margarine. I could fly inside my house and disappoint no one. After moving to the house on Sawyer Street, I was old enough to stay up late and watch weekend sci-fi reruns on Channel 4. They were hosted by a fake vampire named Sammy Terry, who rose theatrically from his casket to introduce films and who talked to a spider named George on a string. I was mesmerized by Technicolor, reds as rich as nuclear fire, greens as thick as our tornado skies, and by the West, where Hollywood rockets stood and above which space became real, more real than the joke for our own town, India, no place. Enviously, I watched the convoys at the gates, the guard stations, and the guards themselves with their white helmets, dry mountains in the distance, the discernment of badges, the passing through. Panning, there was the base, its test blocks and tarmac, cranes and gantries, flying wings, reactor cores wired to stanchions that strode like tripods across the tumbleweeds. Yesterday's West that I thought would be tomorrow. Epaulets and lab coats burning, beakers steaming broken at the climax, the trim girl done screaming, who becomes the denouement. Because my telescope, the Edmund Space Conqueror, proved to be so tetchy for a young boy's hands, I spent more time dreaming about space than looking at it and imagining America's Golden West. And in this reverie for elsewhere, I was encouraged by shortwave broadcast on a portable receiver from Radio Shack, whose quavering night voices from Radio Moscow and timekeeping beeps from the Royal Observatory in England's Greenwich I listened to in the dark. It seemed as though they signaled from other worlds. The radio glowed a benthic green, and zones were different, explained a chart. And in the garage, my father told me that half the globe was already living in tomorrow. When he left us in 1971, the summer of Apollo 15, had he gone to that other half of the world? That was the universe of my childhood moon. When I imagined standing there, it wasn't the lunar surface of Apollo 11 or the view through a telescope or what Apollo 15 would show us in color. It was a movie moon, serrated, spired with towers of rock, sharp-peaked like the Tetons I'd seen in library books. It was a child's moon, Desire's moon, almost ridiculously rugged. It was Chesley Bonistell's moon, and it was one that set up so many, including Apollo 8, the first humans to go there, for disappointment with the real thing. And so I go on and I tell a little bit of the story of Chesley Bonestell and his influence on people who wanted to take us to outer space, and yet this sort of strange, despite his accurate depiction of many aspects of the solar system. And again, Chesley Bonestell is doing this in the 40s and 50s primarily, continues throughout his life. I think he dies in the 1980s. And he's giving us images of the solar system that are sort of previews of what we would see from satellites in a kind of grand tradition of like the Hudson River School in the United States, like these painters who go out to quote unquote frontier and present these stylized, romantic images of what the landscape looks like. And so this is what Chesley Bonestell gives us, but it's not what the moon looks like. The moon looks more like this. Well, those are my telescopes. Sorry, I got that slightly out of order. These are pictures of the real moon. This is what it actually looks like. This is the South Pole, and you can see it's rounded, it's softer, it's just not, it doesn't have this alpine sort of or Himalayan kind of feel to it. So this is the moon that we actually encounter, and I'll spare you the science stuff. I can talk at length about these various features. And I hope that in the book I make them interesting. One of the challenges of writing the book was to try to convey a landscape. It's like a nature writer going to a place a reader has not been to before. And I've not been to the moon except through my telescope. And so kind of trying to convey that to people was a challenge. So I want to just end my portion here, and then I'd love to hear from Francis. And I thought I would read a little bit about Apollo 15. And just again to emphasize, part of the story that I tell in this book is, I mean, at the beginning of the planning for the Apollo missions in the early 1960s, and these conversations it's like mind-boggling to sort of come across them. And William Finney wrote a book about the training of the Apollo astronauts, and he conveys a couple of conversations in which people at NASA headquarters cannot imagine why you would pick up rocks on the moon. Like, we're going to get there, we're going to land there, we're going to beat the Soviets. And then the thought was, well, maybe we should have something to do while we're there. We'll pick up a few rocks. And the response was, well, why would we do that? And then headquarters gets convinced, sure, we'll go there, we'll pick up some rocks. Well, when we go back, maybe we should pick up some more rocks and learn a little bit more about the moon and the earth and the cosmos. And the response was, why would you pick up more rocks? You've already been there and picked up rocks. So this is sort of movement from that kind of scientific illiteracy, in a sense, to what happens on Apollo 15, really the greatest human expedition in the history of science. Going there, these three crew members who essentially have masters, become essentially the equivalent of having master's degrees in geology, looking at the moon with this great precision and a sense of enthusiasm that they bring that other crews didn't quite have because they didn't have that scientific background. So here's a little bit about Apollo 15, and we'll end there, and can't wait to hear what Francis has to say. This is also this is an excerpt from the chapter on that mission, and the thesis has been that you hear here in just a second, you've been prepared for, and I return to it at the end of the book. But I say, the moon must have poets among its explorers. In a way, on Apollo 15, it did. The morning after Al Warden's return to his earthly home, he was shocked when he stepped out to get the paper. There was the moon. He was beginning to grapple with the scope, details, and feelings of the Apollo 15 mission and his return from space. NASA never trained me in public speaking, he said. Certainly, they didn't train anyone in creative writing. Whereas Alan Bean of Apollo 12 came to his moonwalk with a personal interest in painting and training in it, Warden was unprepared. But he wrote, sometimes in the middle of the night, alone in his post-divorce Houston apartment. Mindful of war and poverty, uncertain as to our ability to crack through the crust of ego and politics, Warden looked at the surface of the moon both as intensely real and as a parable for possible destruction. And this is from one of his poems. The moon must teach us not only of age and geology, planets and solar puzzles, but of life, else we end up like her. Warden also wrote of the personal costs of Apollo, but God forgive, he said, the friends erased. In his poem Moonscape, he called the lunar surface a fantastic procession. With each crater a lesson, he wrote, there's an order implied by the jigsaw of features. In the order of time, the moon is our book. Now, if a reader can set aside his kind of neophyte love of exact rhyme, Warden's intuition begins to come through. Metaphor is a quest and convergence. It's a chance at exploratory precision. A metaphor is a test flight, revealing more than known at takeoff. If it succeeds, it lands on the ground. It also excavates and grows from. It evolves. Its dimensions can become enormous while staying folded intimately like an eternal origami crane. To convey a place, we must be open to it, or really suffused by it, learn it, and set aside what should be set aside. And more, we must find ways to speak it beyond familiar words used anywhere in any context. To be a good human requires living the paradox of the marvels of adventure and the clarities of home. It requires the sublime nature of place to inform the humble act of householding. Apollo 15's Al Worden made it clear in his poetry and in his memoir that he felt at home in zero gravity, at home flying over the moon that had been made so accessible and exciting to him, and at home as he wrote his naive and often moving poems. So, of course, that's it. Al Worden, you showed me. I knew it, but it must be felt like a soaring in the chest. Homecoming is wherever one is. Householding is wherever one is. And keeping home is the home keeping you. Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation, Christopher. You surely love the moon. Great. Now, Francis, please, it's your turn. Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, please.
Wonderful. I'm delighted to talk and follow up from what Christopher said about Apollo 15 being the high point of human exploration. Let me just tell you a little bit about Christopher and his book, though, too. I've never met Christopher, but I want to emphasize why everybody needs to read this book. I was fortunate enough to be reading this book back in February. I was on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I was talking about the space program to guests out there. And there was a night where the Odysseus spacecraft was landing on the moon, or mostly landing on the moon. It had a little tip over at the end. But I'm looking at the Atlantic Ocean, which is just this wonderful, barren desert in many ways of human imagination. There's no features other than the light and the change of light. And I'm looking at the full moon that's beginning to set, and I'm talking to people about the space program, and I'm watching this spacecraft land through a satellite, which is part of the space program. Otherwise, I can't talk to anybody in a ship in the middle of the ocean. And in the middle of all this, I'm reading an advanced copy of Christopher's book. It was the perfect place to read his book. And if it had not been a good book, it would have been a terrible experience. It would have been a waste, as it was, because it's such a great book. It emphasized this feeling of being in the middle of all this exploration, because I think he gets something that most people don't get. Most of the time I'm reading this book going, no, this guy gets it. Because, just as many of these ancient cultures he was talking about, the moon was seen almost as a mirror reflecting back on Earth, and the features that people saw on the moon they thought was a mirror image of our Earth. So Christopher is actually looking at us much more than the moon. The moon is, as we come to understand the moon over time, it's a reflection of who we are as a society and many different societies and cultures. And I just loved how he takes us on this exploration through that. And we really get to understand ourselves as much as we get to understand the moon. It reflects us. And that wonderful juxtaposition between the more clarity you get, sometimes you lose the romance. The fact that the moon was anything to anybody allowed it to be this wonderful interpretation of anything we wanted to be. And then, as he mentions, when you get there on Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, some of the most safe places to land, it looks like a gravel pit. And people on Earth are like, this is the romantic moon we've been brought up. This looks boring. And what Chris really gets, which people in Europe got at the time, Europeans got it, the Italians got it, the French got it, the English got it, Americans did not get it, which is by the time of Apollo 15, that's where the grandeur and the majesty of the moon begins to get explored. And that's where the Americans who have turned off, they're literally complaining that I Love Lucy reruns are being interrupted by a little bit of footage of people exploring the mountains of the moon in person. It's awful. The British got it, the Italians got it, the French got it, everybody in Europe got it, the Germans got it, because they're like, there are people living on the moon for 3 days. There are people driving cars around. There are people going to sleep, waking up, another day on the moon. I mean, Chris gets this in a way that, frankly, most Americans don't get. And as somebody who grew up in England and now lives in America, it's a fascinating intersection of cultures. And the fact that the more you learn, you don't lose the wonder. It enhances the wonder. And as Chris said, we're planning on going back to the moon, and it's been half a century or longer now, to the point where there's a whole romance around the lost moon that we had, that we were there for 4 years and we've never been back. And so there's a pining for a past that at one time was the future. So Christopher gets that so well in this book, and I'm, as you can tell, I'm extremely enthusiastic about this book and his prior book, Beyond Earth's Edge, which we have time. I'd love to talk about that too. But specifically, what you asked me to talk about, yeah, Apollo 15 was in 1971, long after America had literally and figuratively switched off. I think the high point of human exploration. And a lot of it's to do with the three people who were on it. Dave Scott, the commander, he is the only person in the world now left alive who can tell you what it's like to land a spacecraft on the moon. There are other lunar module pilots around, but he's the only commander of a lunar landing mission who's still alive, which gives you a sense of the original history beginning to close. We are beginning to lose those firsthand stories. Most people focus on the people who walked on the moon. That's the thing that was the most romantic. That was the thing that was the most exciting to the general public. I was fortunate enough to meet and work with all 12 of the people who walked on the moon. Had some fascinating personal literary experiences with them. But what Christopher gets in this book, again, he gets it in a way that most people don't, is the people who spent their time around the moon, who didn't land, in many ways had a more vivid poetic experience. And I'm so thankful for Christopher for getting that in the book and sharing the story of Al Worden, who, as he mentions, I wrote his memoir, Falling to Earth, with. I also wrote a follow-up book, The Light of Earth, with, and we even wrote a children's book together, which also explores what it's like to spend 6 days around the moon, 3 of them totally alone. And I have to say, if you were given the opportunity to visit planet Earth and you'd never been there, which would you choose? Would you choose to spend 6 days orbiting, looking at sunrises and sunsets and looking at all the gorgeous majesty of our Earth from above? Or if you were told you can land in a gravel pit for 3 days and just walk a mile in each direction, I think I would choose the orbit. And it's the same with the moon. It's something that Al, and I was so fortunate to be able to help him try and share this, Al describes so well. He had this experience on the far side of the moon, the most remote person then and now in human history. He was further away from anybody else has ever been and ever maybe will be for a long time. There were 2 other people on the far side of the moon, many, many hundreds of miles from him. Everybody else was 250,000 miles away on the Earth. And he's looking out at the vastness of the universe, where there's no radio signal can reach him from Earth. There's no radio signal can reach him from his fellows on the moon. He is as cut off as you can be, looking out at the Milky Way, thinking, I don't know where I am. I don't know what this means, but I know it means something. I'm the end of the tip of the spear of human experience at this moment. And I am not able to describe what this means, because it's going to take centuries or thousands of years until people understand what I'm doing right now. I'm part of a process. And for an Air Force fighter pilot from a small town, Michigan Depression era farmland, who had no grounding in literature or history, or to have this realization that I don't know where I am, but I know this is important in human history. That's such a wonderful, evocative moment. So then, as Christopher describes, he gets back home to Earth. He's living in the ultimate 1970s bachelor pad around the corner from the Space Center in Houston. It has a spiral staircase with shag carpeting on it. It has silver mylar curtains above his bed. Some of his astronaut pals asked to use the key at lunchtime when they want to take other people for other assignations there. It's the bachelor pad. And he gets back from the moon. His whole family are there. They're partying into the night. And he has been up all day talking about the space program, doing these very technical debriefs with the people back at the Space Center. Spends all day doing that, gets home, wants to sleep, everybody's partying. Finally, 3 a.m., he manages to kick everybody out every night. And then he can't sleep, of course. He's too amped up. So he sits there in the dark on his own with these yellow legal pads. You're probably familiar with those, with coffee rings, stains all over them as he's drinking coffee, just writing random words about what the other debrief was, his personal debrief, what it was like to go to the moon in those immediate days and weeks afterwards. And he doesn't mean to be writing poetry. He's just writing thoughts. After a while, he realizes these impressions are something he could turn into poems, sometimes without almost any editing, sometimes with a lot of editing. But I have to think that kind of debrief, and I'm fortunate that he was able to publish them in a poetry book. We found those still copy stained legal yellow pads when I was working with him, and I was able to see there were a whole bunch that were unpublished, and we were able to publish those in a subsequent book called The Light of Earth. Every bit that was left, we managed to get into print. So there's the whole range of his experiences are there. I have to think those debriefs are just as important in some ways to humanity as the technical debriefs. It was very important to know what part of the spacecraft worked, what didn't, but it's also very important for us to know that ultimate question we all have inside ourselves, that what was it like? And if you talk to any Apollo astronaut, they were so fed up of hearing what was it like, because they're like, what do you mean? These guys came back from the moon and they could say, I tell you what I did. I had a checklist. I did 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if I didn't do 4, I was disappointed in myself. I know what I did. That nowhere in there was I supposed to be thinking about what was it like. There was no time to think about what was it like. If I stopped and thought about that, I might die because I was neglecting something that was literally saving my life. It was years, in our case, sometimes weeks to months, but then most people, 20 years until they really got to stop and go, what was that experience like? And that's where it becomes part of a broader sweep of human history that Christopher's book just crystallizes and encapsulates. I mean, I'm so glad he read it to us today, because that was just profoundly beautiful to hear the poetry of it. But the great thing about working with somebody like Al was that feeling of the personal connecting to the ethereal, to the numinous, to the elegiac, to all these things that are usually outside of our experience. I was doing an interview with somebody the other day, some kids in England actually, who were asking me, what's your favorite memory of Al Worden? And I didn't know what to say because there's so many. I happened to have just come back from Cape Canaveral, and it reminded me of working with him so much. And there was a day we were just watching a shuttle launch on the beach out there, and he just looked up at the moon and went, my old friend. And it's the kind of thing you think of as like, you don't ask somebody you're hanging breakfast with, what was it like, over and over again. But there are little moments like that when you just hang out with somebody long enough that you realize this silvery disc 250,000 miles away that looks like it has no features on until you get the telescope out or get the binoculars out, as Christopher described so beautifully. It's a real place to some people. This guy standing next to me, this guy in a Tommy Bahama shirt and Bermuda shorts, he looks like every other Florida senior ever. He went there. He lived there for 6 days. This is his home for a while. This was his career for a while. And now it's part of his century, quarter of a century old history but it's still somewhere familiar. Like, yep, there's my old friend. There's that place I stayed on for 6 days. That to me is still mind blowing. I'm gushing here in ways that I'm all over the place, but I highly encourage you to get back to Christopher's book, because he says this in ways that I can't. And it's just, he gets it. I love this book and I love what he does with it. And I think this is the moment where it's been long enough that people can now start crystallizing Apollo and other missions into that broad sweep of the romantic lunar history. And this is an important book. This is a book that I think in 1,000 years, people are going to go, what were humans doing that century? This book gets it.
I just want to say thank you, Francis. My God, that's I was so delighted when you wrote from out in the ocean to say some of those things. So not to turn this into a mutual admiration society, but just to say how and all of us, I think, in our creative endeavors and or professional endeavors, right, to get that sort of sense of, oh, this other person has sort of seen me or seen this work, right, has gotten it. And I feel the same about what Francis has done in his career as well. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Okay, no.
Yeah, happy to answer questions. Absolutely.
Okay, it was a very interesting talk, Francis. Well, astronauts are human after all. Lisa, please, do you have comments or questions?
Sure, yes. Okay, so many. I thought I might ask how Christopher has changed his relationship with the moon since writing the book. But if I have maybe just one question, I think it might be perhaps more expansive to ask. The moon has always been our teacher in some way, all the way through time. And that relationship has changed as it's gone along. And I'm wondering what the moon has to teach us in this time and over the next, I don't know, 10, 15 years as we go back there again and are reaching further and further into space. The moon is always going to be a launch pad, but it's also going to be much closer to us in our thoughts. And where do you think, how can the moon help us, reach into our future?
Yeah, that is a profoundly important question, I think. And I don't necessarily claim any particular wisdom, in addressing that, except, as I say, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the moon and looking at it. And I think, and I would love to hear everyone weigh in on this. Two things occur to me. One, to pick up on what, Francis was talking about, and maybe this is actually the ground for the two points that I would make. One about how we convey our experiences there, and what those experiences are. Like what do we think we're going to do when we get there, and how do we talk about that? Those, that's really what the book sort of culminates with. My meditating on that and trying to meditate on that with the help of a number of really, smart, interesting people. Alvin Harvey, who's a Navajo Dene astronautical engineer, doctoral candidate at MIT, had an amazing conversation with him about this, and he's also beginning to write about these questions. But I think that Francis's point, and it's only one I've only recently sort of appreciated in a visceral sense, because with 3 other artists, I did a simulated lunar analog mission at a facility near Biosphere 2 in Tucson. And there's a piece coming out in Esquire about that. And it was, 1/1,000,000th of what actual agency astronauts, the Apollo moonwalkers, or what Al Worden had to go through, checklist task every, down to the second, right? And so that task-driven nature of our time on the moon will be replicated to a large degree with the Artemis missions. Now, on the other hand, Jeremy Hansen, who's the Canadian who's going on Artemis 2, told me that they have 12 different public events during that mission. Okay, that's a lot, and I think they understand and they take that seriously. And NASA now, of course, gives its astronauts training in public speaking. They're not doing poetry workshops yet, and they're not doing visual arts workshops. So Lisa and I, and we need to break down the doors at Johnson Space Center. But I think that the moon, because we're going there not only for exploration, but also with this vision of, well, we can take that water ice that's in the permanently shadowed regions of the lunar South Pole in particular, turn that into drinking water, turn that into oxygen, and turn it into fuel, a launching pad, as you said, Lisa. So what will our relationship then be like? Will it be purely exploitative? Will the astronauts who go there, whether, the taikonauts who go there, have that grounding of a deeper sort of respect for the history of the moon in with our species? And so I think they're questions of how we convey our experiences there and what those experiences are. Are they purely sort of exploitative? I don't think they will be, and it's going to be actually very hard, like to get that water ice out of the lunar regolith and make it what I like to think of as a gift that we cherish and that we use responsibly and sustainably. And I think the Moon Village Association in particular, Open Lunar Foundation, other groups, and I think the Artemis 2 astronauts themselves, Victor Glover said that they were the ones who told NASA to add the word sustainably to the tagline. Okay, so I think there's a much broader sense of the need to cherish the moon in these ways. I want us to go back, of course. I was, it's like I want us to go back. I want us to be there. I'd love for human habitations to be there, but a village instead of a colony, right? A heartland instead of a frontier. Those sorts of ways of talking about it and thinking about it will, I hope, help help the conversation along.
Yeah, that's great. I do hope that it's a place where we'll find the best of ourselves, and all these things that are challenging us, we'll be able to reflect more effectively on it, and some of the solutions may be created there that can help us here as well. Yeah, so are there questions from the audience, or do you are there?
No, but we are going to ask Giulio to add his comment.
Great.
Yes, thank you. I've been really fascinated by these two talks. But before commenting to Chris' book, I'd like to come back to the point that Francis made, that the astronauts who did not land on the moon, but stayed around the moon, had perhaps a more vivid experience than those who got to walk on the moon. And as a matter of fact, well, I'm not an astronaut, I have not been there, but my own most vivid remembrance of when I was about 10 years old and I was watching the lunar mission, perhaps is not Apollo 11, but Apollo 8. I was really fascinated by this mission full of Christmas magic of three men who went around the moon. And I do remember them even more than Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And I'm happy to think that perhaps next year, perhaps the year after next, a group of astronauts, including Victor Glover, who you were mentioning, will experience the same thing. And then perhaps also these 8 performers and artists that this Japanese billionaire, whose name I am not able to pronounce, wants to take around the moon on a Starship mission. I hope to see all that. Now, going back to Christopher's book, I have read the book just a few days after it came out last month. And I'm reading it again now, and I completely agree with Francis. It's a great book that I want to recommend to everyone. It's not every day that one gets to read something inspiring and energizing about the moon and our past, but especially future in space, that has been written by someone who really knows how to write and who really knows how to make you feel things and put you in the scene using very vivid word pictures. I believe that you also teach these skills at universities, and I'm sorry I never had the chance to attend one of your courses. Perhaps I'm sure it would have made me a much better writer than I am. Now, to introduce my comments to your book, I must say something about what my own position on all these things is. I am what you could call a space maximalist, in the sense that I believe that space expansion, and I underline this word, not only exploration, but expansion, going to live there on the moon and tomorrow on Mars and other planets and moons of the solar system. I believe space expansion is more important than other things. It's more important than almost anything that I can think of, because In some sense, I don't want to get too much into philosophy and even metaphysics here. I'm persuaded that space expansion is not only our cosmic destiny, but also in some sense is our cosmic duty, duty to ourselves, duty to the universe, duty to life, duty to our ancestors, duty to all the biosphere of the earth. This is our duty to expand all these things beyond the earth. Now, since this is my own philosophical stance as a space maximalist, I must confess that I'm willing to make many more concessions than you to a certain mentality when it comes to space flight that was characteristic of the world a few decades ago. I mean, I'm willing to perhaps not forgive, but I'm willing not to think too much about what Werner von Braun did before going to the US. I'm willing to use expressions like colonization that many people tend to shy away from today. And I don't really see it a big deal. I'm willing to give less importance to environmental and social factors than you. But on the other hand, I understand that today, especially in the cultural climate that we are living in, my own position can seem a bit too extreme to some people. I am too much of a true believer in our destiny in space, and perhaps I'm not enough attentive to environmental, social, and other human concerns. So I don't think that the people like me can really play an important role these days in persuading many other people, and especially younger people, of the importance of human space expansion. And this is a very important thing because, we must persuade the young. Let's see ourselves. I guess I am the oldest here. Lisa and Francis are still young, but perhaps not too young anymore. So really, we should have a talk like this with a lot of 16 years old. When I see that, I will really think that the future of humanity in space is in good hands. And in order to persuade them, in order to use a marketing term, in order to sell the idea of space expansion to many people, and especially to the younger people, I think the world needs more books like yours. And I think the world needs more writers like you. And now, after this comment, my simple question to you would be, what should we do to make the idea of space expansion really sexy again to the young people, like it was when Charlie Bonestel was painting his inaccurate but suggestive landscapes of space.
Well, thank you. No, thank you so much for that. And I hear everything that you're saying, and I'm gonna have to think about space maximalist I like that. I like that description. Yeah, there's a lot there to that we could talk through, but I think to directly address your question, I have no easy answer. I think that the media landscape is so fractured and so fractious that that having the kind of larger cultural narratives of social projects that one had, and again, my reference point is, the US in the 1960s, which I was a child then. So now I'm mostly just like filling it in from reading books about space that Francis has been involved with, histories and so forth, the great cultural narratives of that time, civil rights, Vietnam, the burgeoning environmental consciousness, feminism, political corruption in this country, right, with Watergate, all of those things, and space. So there were a lot of large cultural stories, right? And of course, we have our own stories right now: climate change, the political chaos in this country, the rise of fascism and wars and all. It's like we're never not without those stories. But now, because we have this very divided attention span, I think that maybe my quick answer would be I honestly haven't thought about it in those terms quite as precisely as you put them. So I will need to be thinking about this. I think that it's every, I don't know if this is a familiar cliche to everyone, but everything but the kitchen sink. Like, we try everything: social media, we try writing books, we tried talking to school children. Francis is talking to a group of kids in England. Well, all of those things, it's almost impossible to quantify in the moment, but it gives us a sense of aspiration to communicate our interests, as maybe as varied as they are in the details. Still, this shared sense of, like, yes, we should go, right? We should go. And that is not the same thing as escaping, at least from my perspective. Again, to invoke another cliche, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's no reason why we cannot, cope with and try to solve the concerns and issues that face us today, which are difficult, and at the same time explore the moon, explore Mars, and develop human habitations, whatever we want to call them, on those those planets. As I think as Lisa was saying, like, these things are they're not mutually exclusive. So I think that's the narrative, and I was quite heartened in talking with for this piece on art and creative communication of space. I think will be out in a couple days on Esquire magazine's website. Talking with Victor Glover, deeply impressive, very sort of authentic communicator. And my hope is, I think NASA's become quite media savvy in that way, and my hope is that this crew, all four of them, are very good storytellers and communicators, that will be an important sort of reawakening of consciousness about the human future in outer space. That's my hope.
Thank you very much, Chris. This is exactly what I wanted to hear, that these two things are not mutually exclusive, and we can and should do both. That was the point I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are getting closer to the end, unfortunately. But before the end, I would like to ask Chris, can you read us the final paragraph of the book?
Yeah, request from the audience. I like it. Okay. I'm glad you're not asking me to play a song I don't know. that would not work. Well, again, thank you all so much. It's lovely and very affirming to have you all be a part of this and saying these lovely things about a book that I loved, writing. And as I get to that point here, to answer Lisa's question very briefly, like, my relationship to the moon is just is in a sense the same. Like, I've got my telescope out this week, the moon is up, and I'm revisiting old friends, and my wife says, well, what else is there for you to see up there? I'm like, quite a bit, actually. So this is the end of the book, the last paragraph. When the moon rises between buildings or over trees, It's not just a beautiful sight. It is an archive of human feelings and material truths. The moon is more than a rock. It's a story. It's many stories. The moon signals what came before and what comes after, and I can't wait to look again when the next lunation begins. There is much to see. Known by reason and held by love, the moon invites our gaze and our gasps, the sights and breath of awe, the glow and rhythm of dwelling itself.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you
Fantastic.
all. Thank you all. It was a great webinar. And I hope that we'll see Christopher again before the end of the year to tell us about your experience in the analog side.
We survived, so that was the main takeaway.
So,
Thank you guys so much.
When is the Esquire article coming out?
I was told I was told Thursday.
Oh
but
gosh, okay.
I don't know for sure.
Right. I
So
want to read it. Yeah.
yeah, I'd welcome feedback from all of you on it, because it really is cutting to this question of how we talk about it. And Francis's point about how hard it was for the Apollo astronauts to sort of have the time and space to get to that.
Yeah,
where they
I
could
hope they've worked on that with the astronauts. In a way, astronauts have even bigger demands now because they realize that they have to connect with the public about it.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I only think that once they get going, once they're there, it'll be, unmissable. Everybody, there will be this huge, swivel to what's happening there. And, there'll be naysayers and all sorts of things, but really it'll be the most fascinating thing happening,
Yeah. I would say too, Lisa, and this, I mean, we could talk about this as a group, another time too, but I was always, writing about this for Astronomy Magazine, sort of like with, a cynical sense of like, God, this is taking a long time. These missions are so spaced out. But it actually occurred to me, and Victor Glover's said, he's like, well, what we say about the moon will last for a couple of years because the mission cadence is slower. It may actually help because Apollo's cadence was so fast. And because it was such, a geopolitical like victory, like we got there, we did it. And then the interest drops out. So it might be that the slower pace for Artemis might actually be beneficial. I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Francis. Thank you, Christopher. Thank
Thank
you
you so much. Yeah.
Bye.
Amazing book.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Francis, for helping.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Francis.